Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Juan Zarate. I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS. On behalf of Dr. Hamry and all of the senior leadership and the board of CSIS, I welcome you. For those of you who are new to CSIS, this building is relatively new, so we hope you enjoy it. It's a great space. Hopefully during the networking and lunch times you get a chance to explore the building. Really is a great place to have a significant conference like the summit we're having here today. It really is an honor and a privilege for me to be welcoming you on behalf of CSIS, but this is an endeavor led by the ladies up front here and all of you. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue has been a major driver for this initiative for women in extremism. The State Department has been an incredibly important partner in not just setting up the summit, but in driving many of the initiatives. And I know that the next 2 days will be an important set of discussions, both in the sessions we have officially and then obviously in the networking to talk about the issues of women and extremism. Let me begin by talking about the importance of this issue in terms of the broader national security issues that are at play. There's no question that the role of women in extremism and radicalization has been with us for some time. Many of you have been studying it, have been activists in this field for years. And so in some ways, the summit today is not a new set of issues. And in fact, as you looked at the problem of terrorism globally, the role of women both as radical sympathizers as well as activists has been with counterterrorism officials for years. The problem of the black widows, for example, in Central Asia and out of the Caucasus has been one that has in some ways romanticized the role of women in terrorism. And we've seen, of course, the acceleration of the attractiveness of groups like the Islamic State and elements of Al-Qaeda begin to draw from new populations of young women around the world. But at the same time, we've also grappled with how women can be a counterforce, a counter-network to the allure and the radicalization and the ideology of these groups. How women empowered as mothers, as sisters, as powerful women around the world can network and coalesce in communities of interest to counter the ideology in the home, globally, in businesses, in any aspect of life, how women in many ways play a central role in countering the ideology. Those issues now are coming to the fore. And I'm honored to be with all of you who've obviously dedicated your time and lives to this issue, and certainly to the leaders on the stage who are with us. The program for the next 2 days is ambitious. We have a number of discussions with experts outside of government as well as in government. We are live streaming this and recording the sessions today. Let me talk a little bit about the social media and rules around the next couple of days, in part because we want to make sure that everyone's comfortable and understands, especially as we use social media, how we're going to interact. The only session that's going to be on the record will be the first panel, the one I'll be moderating. After that, the sessions will be off the record, but we'll be operating under the Chatham House rules. And so we want you to be able to use the information and experience that is a part of the 2 days, but we're not going to attribute those statements or comments to particular individuals. At the same time, we want you to use social media, so use the hashtag Challenge Extremism. That's the hashtag we're using for the summit the next couple of days. But please don't attribute statements to particular individuals. Lastly, if you decide to take photos or videos, we ask that you be very sensitive to the fact that we have visitors from around the world. We want to be careful about safety and security. And so certainly don't take a picture or video, and certainly don't post it without the authorization of the people that you're taking the picture of. So we just want to be very sensitive and cautious about that. So let me just begin again by welcoming you. I think these 2 days are going to be remarkably illuminating as people around the world grapple with the question of how we think about women in extremism. Again, with much of the world focused on the challenges from a terrorism perspective and a radicalization perspective, but for many of you and for those who are steeped in this field, thinking about the role of women in countering the ideology and radicalization that's happening in our communities. And so for that, we have a distinguished set of guests, and I'm going to invite them up to introduce themselves and obviously to introduce their roles in today's summit. I'm honored I want to thank the individuals here because they've brought not just their expertise and their gravitas, but also their institutions to bear on these issues. And so I want to thank Sasha Havlicek and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and all of her colleagues for driving this issue, not just in London, but globally. She just came from Norway and leading several efforts there. She's all around the world. I can't keep up with her schedule. Farah Pandith to her right, former special representative to Muslim communities, the first ever for the U.S. government. Count her as a close and deep friend and counselor, doing remarkable work up at Harvard, continuing to work with Sasha at ISD, and beginning to do some work with us here at CSIS. And then Assistant Secretary Evan Ryan, who is a remarkable leader in the space, not just in her current role at the State Department, but also in the role that she played at the White House with the Vice President. And I got to meet Secretary Ryan recently, and she's a remarkable leader in the space, and I think this country's fortunate to have her in her position. And so we're fortunate to be here today, and I want to thank again the institutions and the leaders who are with us. Secretary Ryan, why don't I invite you up? And again, thank you to all of you for your time and attention. I look forward to the day and the two-day summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for hosting us here today in this beautiful new building. I live just a few blocks away. I've been very eager to see this new CSIS space, so it's really wonderful to be here with you, and it's stunning, so thank you. I want to also thank Farah and Sasha, who I've gotten to know both of them quite well, and they both individually are doing amazing work in this space on opposite sides of the Atlantic. They are partnered together in this effort, and really the possibilities in terms of the advancements we can make on this very critical issue with the two of them partnered together are really endless, and so we're really grateful for both of their work in this space. I'm honored to join you and would like to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Department of State and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs for hosting this event and including the 25 distinguished women in this room who are participating in one of our exchanges, an international visitor leadership program, which we've entitled Women Preventing Violent Extremism. We've been working and collaborating with Farah and Sasha to get to this day, so it's exciting for us to see you all here with us because this is something we've talked about for a while. To all of the international women on our exchange who are here with us, we want to congratulate you on your remarkable accomplishments and your efforts in your communities to combat violent extremism. It is my great pleasure to officially welcome you to the United States. And I have had a chance to read your biographies to learn more about you and your work back home. And all I can say is you're an incredibly inspiring group. And what we aim to achieve with exchanges is not just the sense that you can come here and learn about our best practices in the United States, but that you can also network and learn from one another. So I'm very excited that you all are going to have the chance to work together to confront this really critical issue that we have before us today. You are all leaders by example and in accomplishment. And I hope that this exchange experience will strengthen your capacity to lead in finding solutions to the many challenges you tackle every day. To all summit attendees, I ask, what is the first thing you think of when you hear the words countering violent extremism? If you're like most people, you flash immediately to the pictures that we see on the news. You see countering violent extremism in terms of a violent response, an armed response, a military response. I'd like to propose that countering violent extremism is much broader than that. We absolutely have to resist violence by the strongest means, yes, but if our entire strategy is to wait to do something after the violence has happened, we're not doing enough. Countering violent extremism is about prevention. It's about civil society, building strong, cohesive networks and communities that are resilient and resistant to the influence and recruitment of terrorist groups. What do we do about people who may not be in the midst of conflict, but who are cowed into submission by the threat of conflict or the threat of violence, or intimidated into silence because even though the extremists are not on their doorstep right now, they might be next day, the next month, the next year? How do we help others better understand the true root causes of violent extremism, including a lack of a sense of belonging, a lack of a sense of identity, to push back against hopelessness and fear? How do we give people the knowledge and the skills, the confidence to resist, to stand firm, and to succeed? People-to-people exchanges can absolutely be central to these efforts. Personal ties can become a beacon of hope, solidarity, and support in the midst of darkness. Educational and cultural exchanges are about elevating and empowering people individually and humanity collectively. They bring an understanding of people, things, and the world around us. They provide tools to solve complex problems and make people's lives better all over the world. Exchanges foster respect for others and appreciation of alternative approaches to problem solving. An educated citizenry with respect for the diversity of people who are in our families, our communities, our nations, and around the world is exactly what we are all fighting for. We have a responsibility to confront, challenge, thwart, and yes, prevent violent extremism in every way that we can. We must strive to make a better world for our children. Each of us has a responsibility to participate in our communities, to work to prevent ideologies that lead to violence that can threaten us all. There are so many ways that we can do that. Help our youth get an education and a satisfying job, encourage education, community networking, entrepreneurship, cross-cultural tolerance, and social connection. And offer guidance, support, and mentoring so that young people see a bright future full of possibilities. Most of all, we must offer the next generation something tangible to believe in. Violent extremists tell them that the world is bleak and hopeless. They tell them that they are victims and that they should reject, abandon, and burn everything down. By working together, we can show them the opposite, that the world has promise and opportunity, and that they have an essential role, even a responsibility, to help us all build a better world. Thank you for having me here today, again, Juan, and we're eager to commence our discussion.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Juan. A huge, huge thanks to you personally and to this wonderful institution, CSIS, for hosting us here. Before I continue with my thanks, I just want to say how wonderful it is to see so many women in one room on the topic of CVE. So I'd like to just start by saying it's actually all too rare, and I think this is one of the things that we hope to address with this session. I've been asked to say just a few words about my organization, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, about the approach that we take to this set of issues that we've been working on for quite a while now, nearly 10 years. And then I will have the opportunity during the course of the day to tell you a little bit more about some of the innovations we've been applying, trialing in this space. And I look very much forward to building the relationships in this room, to speaking with every one of you, and to forging what I hope will be an important brain trust on this challenge, which is emerging very fast, and an action network to start to respond. So just a couple of words about ISD. We are a London-based global think tank. A think tank, we like to think with a difference, in that we are heavily action-oriented. We like to look at solutions, not just to opine on the problem. And when we started to work on the challenge of violent extremism across different ideologies nearly 10 years ago, what we saw was that there was an enormous amount of opining on the problem, and the think tank community is very good at that, but there was much, much too little doing about the problem. And so what we did was turn ourselves into a kind of experiment. We wanted to see if we could trial and test out responses, evaluate and measure whether those responses were being effective in any way. And in doing that, we were taking risks. And so just to give you a very, very, very quick snippet into the kinds of projects that we've run, and there are materials in your packs that give you an in-depth insight into some of these programs, from forging the first global network of former extremists and survivors of extremism, a unique network of voices, of credible voices in pushing back extremist narratives, to forging partnerships with the likes of Google and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook that have helped us pioneer new approaches to pushing back the extremist propaganda and recruitment machinery online, which, as you all know, has been extremely sophisticated and effective, to finding new ways in which to inspire and enlighten young people to push back on the recruitment that is happening both on and offline. And I look forward to talking a little bit about some of those practices and models that we feel have worked. We have a day tomorrow, a very in-depth exchange about the various initiatives and innovations that all of you bring to the table, a few of the innovations that we hope to bring to the table to share with you, many of which desperately need scaling up. And in order to scale up, we require networks. Without credible voices, there can be no counter-messaging, there can be no pushback. And so at the center of everything that we do at ISD is this focus on building the relevant networks of people that can really push back. This is networks of individuals rather than institutions. This is important to us. So I am extremely grateful to be here today. I'm going to leave it to Farah to tell you more about the Women and Extremism initiative that we've launched some months ago. But before that, just to bring your attention to two reports, which I hope you've been handed as you walked in the door. These are pieces of research that we've done at the Institute based on a unique database of over 100 women's social media presences who have traveled to ISIS territory from foreign countries and joined ISIS. It provides a very, very in-depth insight into the experiences of these mainly young women who have emigrated to ISIS territory. And we do research with one purpose, and that is to provide a deep insight and underpinning to inform practical response. And so I invite you to look into some of the findings of this research, and I will share some of that with you later. And one of the authors of that research, Erin Saltman, is here in the room and will be, of course, part of these discussions as we go forward. But I look very much forward to working with you, and now have the great pleasure and honor of passing the floor to Farah Pandith, who will tell you more about the objectives of this initiative. Thank you.
So good morning to everybody. Everybody's very wide awake and nodding as everybody's talking. I've been watching that. That's really great. The first thing I want to say is congratulations, because having been at the State Department, I understand the important role that the IVLP program places for our nation. And I also know how selective it is. So you should be patting yourselves on the back. You have been selected to be part of a really special group of people, not just now, but in the years to come, a really wonderful international network. So congratulations to you all, and I'm feeling very honored that you are part of this conversation today. So good morning and hello. I think Sasha told you heard my name is Farah Pandith. I'm the former special representative to Muslim communities. I have been asked to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the Women and Extremism program. How did it start and why did it start? In my former role, I'm not in government anymore, I want to be clear, but I had the fortune of serving my country in two different administrations, both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration. And in the capacities that I served my nation, I had the privilege of traveling around the world and talking to young people under the age of 30 all over the world. As special representative, I traveled to more than 80 countries talking to Muslim millennials about what was happening in their communities and what was taking place. And during the course of that time, I kept hearing the same refrain over and over again from women, which was, something is happening here. Something is happening here. We can't quite put our hands on it, but our communities are changing. Not just watching our young people go in a different direction, but we ourselves are finding a different place in our communities. And that played out in a wide variety of ways, whether I was in Malaysia or whether I was in Sweden, whether I was in Uganda, whether I was in Tajikistan. Women were saying the same thing to me. And I'd say, well, what is actually happening? And they'd say, well, first of all, foreign ideologies are coming in and they're changing our way of life. They're making us think differently about the way we raise our children and how we must live and breathe and act. And this was beginning to really bother me. And after I got to about the 25th or 30th country and I kept hearing the same thing, I began to think, my God, there is a pattern here. I'm not doing a research project, but I am seeing something. So what do you do when you begin to see things? You begin to talk to people who are super smart and say, are you guys seeing the same thing I'm seeing? And so I began to do that. And people weren't actually looking at women, surprise, surprise, on this issue. And I was getting more and more frustrated. So I eventually went to Secretary Clinton and said, I'm seeing this. I don't know what is going on. We have one-offs on women who have become radicalized, but the intel community isn't quite where we need them to be, and the external community outside of governments isn't where we need to be. And so when I finished my time as special representative, by the time I got to the end, I had been really seized with this, we need to do more. But before I left the State Department, I did something super smart. I looked around and I said, who are my partners on this? And I went into the Education and Cultural Affairs Bureau and I said to Evan, can I talk to you about something that I think is really important? And all of you are leaders here, so you know how important it is to pick the right people, to build the right coalitions. And in my view, there was only one person at the Department of State that A, I trusted, and B, I knew could get something done, and that was Assistant Secretary Ryan. And what she did was sat down with me and said, okay, what is it that you're seeing and how can we help? And so we began to formulate this idea of pulling together some of the smartest women around the world to come together to talk about this issue in a real way. And the second smart thing I did was I found my partner in crime who I've been pulling along in all kinds of ways, and she's been pulling me too, to think strategically about things. And I said, Sasha, we have an opportunity here to do something really big. And so what we did is the two partners in crime came together and said, okay, let's build a program around this and have three important goals in this program. The first was to convene for the first time a brain trust, a global brain trust on women's agency and extremist movements. And that would include experts on the subject or closely related fields of exploration from both the academic and practitioner sense. And what would that do? That would create a research agenda and be able to we would be able to identify the research partners that would help us give us the data that we need to prove what it is that we're seeing. Okay, we needed that anchor. The second thing is we knew that in the online space a lot was taking place, so we needed to build the credible voices and activists, including, as Sasha talked about, both survivors of extremism and former extremists from around the world, to become that voice and help us to understand how to think about what was taking place in the online space. But the third goal, which was also really important, was not to just ignore what was happening in country and in region in the offline space. So how do you build the networks of people, the activists, because there are so many initiatives that are happening in a very micro way and some in a little bit bigger way around the world. How do we bring them together to help us explore and understand this issue? So those were the three goals. And as we began to build the program, the first thing we definitely needed to do was to create the platform here. And so what you're going to see over the course of the next 2 days, I hope, are in-depth discussions about the threat that we face, that you heard Juan talk about, that you heard Evan talk about, and you heard Sasha talk about. You are in this. You've been chosen because you have something to say and something to contribute to this 2-day project here, but more globally, this initiative that we're building, and we feel very honored that you're part of it. I feel honored that I have 3 partners on the stage who have been really visionary in how we've thought about this, and I know going forward, I hope, we'll be able to push both the government communities around the world and the civil society communities in a new way to take hold of this issue. There shouldn't be a need to look at how women get radicalized, but they are getting radicalized. And we also know that women are canaries in the coal mine and can do a lot in terms of pushing back against that extremist narrative. So with that, I think that's the overview of the Women in Extremism platform. We welcome you, congratulations, and I look forward to having a conversation with you over the next 2 days. Thanks so much. We're going to do a stage set.
Yeah, with that, we are going to move into the first panel. I'd welcome all of the distinguished ladies who've walked in the door. Please, there are seats available here. Karen, please, either at the table or on the side. I want to make sure to welcome everybody.
Karen, there's a seat right there.
And again, we want to make this as comfortable and conversational as possible, so feel free to get up and get coffee, juice, as need be. You're not going to offend me, certainly.
I think we have to also make sure that the cameras are off for the first session.
The first session is wrong. Yeah, so just a reminder, again, the first session, this panel, is on the record. After that, it will not be on the record. The summit will not be on the record. Good. Welcome. All right. Why don't we begin? This is a great session as a bit of a chapeau, if you will, to the summit, to hear in more detail from Evan and Farah about their work historically, their current work, and certainly the role of the U.S. government in this space. We've been through an evolution, I think, in the U.S. government as to how we think about extremism writ large. The White House recently hosting its Countering Violent Extremism Summit. But I think in recent years, thanks to your leadership and others, a realization that women have a central role to play, both in the government and in civil society. And so I think this is a great way of starting the discussion to hear from Evan and Farah about this. Farah, you had mentioned sort of that something's happening. And I think one of the advantages that both you and Evan have is that you've traveled around the world on behalf of the U.S. You've been to numerous countries. You've interacted with women around the world of various roles and responsibilities, both in government and civil society. You know, if you had to say in 2 or 3 minutes what is happening in terms of extremism and women, how would you describe that? Farah, let's start with you. You started to touch on it a bit, but I think it's really important to sort of give a sense from your experience. What are you seeing, and how do you explain what's happening now in 2015?
So, you know, Evan talked about the crisis of identity, and I think one of the things that I want to sort of hone in on is the fact that Muslim millennials are going through something very particular to their generation. In the context of 9/11, in the aftermath, we are seeing, if you're just pulling yourself all the way down to sort of what is at the core of some of the persuasion that is being allowed to happen. It's because these young people are asking questions about themselves. How can I be modern and Muslim? What's the difference between culture and religion? And the phenomenon for me as I watched it was not just Muslims living, both men and women, by the way, in countries that are Muslim, where they live as a minority, but also where they live as a majority. And that was a really important data point for me, because oftentimes you think, well, boy, if you're in Malaysia or in Indonesia, if you're in Pakistan, Afghanistan, these are countries that have a majority of people that are Muslim. Surely young millennials couldn't be going through this, but they were. And there are a lot of reasons why that identity crisis was taking place. But because of that opening, when they're asking questions about themselves, the loudest voices in the communities that persuade them a particular way are the ones that are pulling that thread, that are making them go in a different way. So for me, one of the things that I was really hearing was, yes, they're having a crisis of identity. Then specifically with women, a lot of women were not clear for themselves about who they wanted to be. And so they were often rejecting the heritage or the systems of community and socialization that their mothers had or their grandmothers had, and adopting a different way of life. Not just the way they dressed or what they ate or how they lived their lives, but they were rejecting history and adopting the newest thing that they thought was quote unquote Muslim. And I mention that because I think oftentimes as government, this soft, mushy stuff is very hard for us to absorb. It's anthropological or it's societal, and it's not the hard stuff that we understand well. But indeed, if you're looking at 80,000-foot level of this changes that are taking place with 1/4 of humanity that is Muslim, there's something profound that's going to happen that's not going to impact just civil society, but it's going to impact the way governments conduct themselves and think about what is taking place. So those are some of the things that I definitely saw.
Interesting. Evan, you've taken on this role in terms of your bureau and the State Department. What are you seeing? I mean, how would you explain this to, or how do you explain this to Secretary Kerry as people worry about this issue more and more?
Well, actually, Secretary Kerry has really weighed heavily on us to come up with programming and ideas of how we can really confront this. We meet with him weekly, as Farah knows, and this is really top of mind for him, is what can we do at the State Department, what can we do creatively to help confront this issue? I feel fortunate because at the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, this is what we do. We do exchanges. We bring people here to the United States to learn from us, our best practices, not that we have all the solutions, but we do confront similar challenges here. I know as we've discussed internally, as we've looked at programming, one of the things we've discussed are the similarities between extremism and gang violence here in the United States. What are the similar paths that we can look at that have worked in some of the issues in cities, and what can we do to translate that to extremism overseas? But I can say in terms of our IBLP participants today and our programming as related to women in extremism and the summit that we're very proud to be a part of, we know at the State Department, and Farah knows this well, and it really came up when we sat down initially, that women are really part of the solution. They really are. Women think creatively. Women are mothers who care about the path their children are going to choose. They know that education is key, and they really think creatively and collaboratively, and they work together. I know that there is a mothers network. Yes. Farah and I talked about this. There's a mothers of former extremists, and they try to work to help other mothers stop their children from being radicalized. And I was thinking about this as we were preparing for today. I haven't heard of something similar related to fathers. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Yeah. So women really do look at this issue through a different lens. And for us at the Bureau, what we can do is this. Bring women together, bring them here to the United States, give them the opportunity to explore what we've done here in the United States. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, another key piece of this for us, and we've talked about this, is that you all will have a network. And Sasha mentioned this too. It's important to us that you leave your time here establishing relationships with one another and a network that you can rely on, because as much as we're going to be able to share with you, you're also going to be able to learn from one another. And this is something that Secretary Kerry does recognize himself, the real power of exchanges in terms of shared knowledge, knowledge here in the United States, but even more broadly with one another. And he has charged us to really do what we can. And so we were really pleased to be able to tell him that we're working on this program. And we know that the women here in this room are really going to have a great impact. So we're proud to be working with all of you.
Great. Yeah, in fact, one of the organizations, Sisters Against Violent Extremism, yes. Run by Dr. Edith Schlaffer, who couldn't make it today, but has been innovative in terms of pulling the networks in key countries and communities around the world together based on the model you described.
Exactly, yes.
Let's turn, because Sasha mentioned the reports that ISD has put out in terms of the allure of ISIS and what we're seeing in radicalization. I see some experts in the audience who look at the issue of radicalization and terrorism. What is it about the current environment, whether it's ISIS or the environment writ large and the underlying ideology, that is drawing young women to these movements and to this new sense of identity, to your point, Farah? Certainly in the US, the case of the teenage girls out of Colorado really was sort of a wake-up call. Not an issue new to many of you in the audience, but certainly to the American public. I think that was a bit of a shock that you would have teenage girls, women from Colorado deciding to travel into the hands of a terrorist group as opposed to being safeguarded from it. So what is it about the current environment that seems to be accelerating the radicalization and really altering the identity of women and young girls around the world?
So I'd like to say two things. The first is just going back to your other point about sort of what government is seeing and how we're thinking about things before I get to the question that you asked. I think one of the problems governments, not just ours, but governments around the world, when they look at women, certainly on this issue, it was a blind spot for them. It wasn't something that they were seeing, there wasn't a crisis point yet. There was a one-off woman in Belgium that had done something. There was a one-off woman somewhere else. And there was never this sense of, there was no, unfortunately, evil imagination about what could happen next. Yeah. And I want to make that point because I think it's a really important one for the governments that you all, the countries that you all come from, that you have to be looking at things that are coming down the road, not just what's right in front of you. And I think we really missed an opportunity to be really much more robust in our research and understanding around these issues. The second point to that is, and I'll be very clear about it, I think that there is a lot of stereotyping, I know, around Muslim women, who they are and what they are. And I think if you look at that, I think that there is a connection between, boy, there's no possible way anything could happen to a Muslim woman. She would never take on a role to do that because, indeed, they're very vulnerable. They're very quiet. All these stereotypes that you have in your head, and that is a really important point to make because I think whatever comes next, past ISIS and other things, we cannot be stuck in our stereotypes about what is possible. We need to imagine, unfortunately, the most evil things that could happen. Now, to your question about what is taking place, I know that Sasha is going to talk a lot about the research that ISD has done and what they have found. But I will say at a very, very large level, one of the things, and this connects a little bit to the ECA component here, one of the things that I heard a lot, Juan, in my travels was Muslim women asking me, where can I go to get information? How can I understand my role in society better? Because the guy with the longest beard or the highest hat, we're telling them in their communities how to be a Muslim woman. And oftentimes, a lot of the educational pieces, whether it's stuff that they could read or people they could talk to, were not available for them for actually asking about their own role. And I say that because it's connected to this issue, obviously, of identity, but it's also connected to this gaping hole that was left in societies where the bad guys stepped in and said, you're looking for purpose and belonging, you're looking for understanding your real role of what it really means to be a Muslim woman, let me tell you what that's going to be. I often talk about Sheikh Google as being the place for answers for millennials, and that's true for Muslim millennials as well, who are female. They are looking for answers and hoping to find a purpose, a belonging, and a role that they can play that's larger than themselves, one, and B, that it also allows them to be part of a community that is doing something that is meaningful. And I know that we're going to get into more detail about the dynamics within that, but sort of on the big front, that, and the final point I would just say about what is drawing them in. You often have heard, I think in the course of the last couple of years especially, certainly right after 9/11, and then there was a vacuum, people weren't talking about it, is what is out there to inspire women to be who they can be. And whether you call it role models or you call it initiatives, you haven't seen enough of that on the global stage. You've seen it at a very micro level. So there haven't been enough of a conversation that provides women an opportunity to say, I can see myself in her and in her and in her. Everything is very cloaked. And I think so when we're looking at the aspects of education, role modeling, belonging, identity, those are some of the themes that are a part of the question that you asked.
Evan, what do you think? What's in the current environment that is making this so important now?
Well, I agree with Farah. I think it has a lot to do with identity. I think it's a sense of, I don't want to say glamorous, but I think ISIL is portraying itself as, it's them against the world. And as a young person, there's something appealing about that. I think we've all been through that stage in our lives. Some in college or around that stage where you do feel like you want to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And I think ISIL gives that sense. And then I think people, as you've seen time and again, and we were speaking about this with Sasha a bit backstage, what they're portraying is obviously not the reality. What they're finding is when they're joining ISIL, it's not at all what they've been promised. So what we really do need to do is connect with the people who've left, the formers, and have them tell their story. But I do think that as much as we can message that it is not what they are saying it is, the experience is not going to be life-changing, heroic effort that you've been told it will be, but instead it's going to be demeaning. You are most likely going to lose your life. And that's not something to aim for. So I think the more we can tell that story, I think that's an important piece of this. And so that's one of the things that I know you'll hear this tomorrow from Undersecretary Stengel, that's really an emphasis at the State Department right now, which is the messaging piece. How can we message? And the challenge there is not just how can we message, but how can we really empower voices that are going to be understood to be peer voices. Voices that are going to be relatable, and that's a challenge for us right now too.
Evan, in terms of the environment and what you're doing, what the State Department's doing, Farah, I'm going to ask you the same question or a similar question. What are the types of programs that you're seeing that are effective, or what are some of the innovations in this space that you think are important? Because I know the U.S. government in particular, and other governments as well, but the U.S. government has struggled with the question of, is this about a macro level effort?
Right.
Is this about micro level efforts? Is it about connecting all of the other initiatives we have around women, education, literacy, empowerment, entrepreneurship in these issues? How are you thinking about this, and where are we in that debate around macro versus micro programs?
Well, I can speak a little bit mostly to ECA and our programs. I'll start out actually with one anecdote that relates. We are focusing a lot on entrepreneurship in our programs, and that's something that has also been tasked by the Secretary to us as an understanding that helping people, entrepreneurship is unique to the United States. That's what we know for sure. In the United States, our entrepreneurs are people who have tried to build a business and failed most often and tried again. We in the US really embrace those entrepreneurs who have failed. If you've read the Steve Jobs biography, that's a perfect example. But those who are investing in entrepreneurs in the United States tend to want to pick people who've tried and failed. What we've learned in our programming is that is very unique here. And I've actually had participants who've been on our program say, my family would be greatly shamed if I tried something and failed, so I can't try. So we're really trying, and this is something the Secretary has recognized, to focus on entrepreneurship as a message that this is the way it works in the United States and this is how we do it, hoping to lift people economically, and then really show them that there is a path that they can travel and really build a business and help their family. So this is a piece of it. But what we do know is, the anecdote I was going to tell you is we have a program called Tech Women. And Tech Women is focused on women in the Middle East and North Africa region and Sub-Saharan Africa. We bring women here on an exchange just like this, here to the United States, except we bring them to Silicon Valley, although I know you're also going to Silicon Valley. And they're there for about 5 weeks. And they're mentored at Silicon Valley, and each individually in individual companies, and then travel back to their countries and they build their businesses. And then they've got that network as well. And these women are so enthusiastic. It's a wonderful program. And this one woman I sat next to when she was in Washington, who came from Lebanon, I asked her how her family felt about her traveling to the US and to Silicon Valley, and she said they were very excited for her, except for her brother, who was not excited and said, why can't there be something like this for me? So this is the struggle I think we're confronting right now is, are there men in the Middle East that we should be focused on from a programming perspective as it relates to entrepreneurship and possibilities? And we have many academic programs as well, and those are obviously for men and women and they're broad. But I do think that as much as we can, because our goal in ECA is to work with our embassies, and in the case today with ISD, to identify the best of the best. And Farah articulated that as well. She knows that because she's done this with us. But really, our US embassies in partnership with others try to identify the best of the best, like all of you, because we know that when you return, you will have an impact in your communities and your countries, a larger impact, and that can be a multiplier effect. So our goal with our programs is to look at the best programs that can have that multiplier effect and reach the right people so that we can affect change. Or not that we can, but that you can affect change. And that's what we endeavor to do.
That's great. Farah, can you touch on that? And
Sure.
also maybe a little bit, I want to blend into this because of the role of this network and the individuals with us today. Sort of, what are the limitations of the U.S. government, and why is it so important to have civil society? Evan, you mentioned that in your opening remarks, civil society driving a lot of this. So answer the first question, but then delve into the second.
So I'll pick up, thank you. I'll pick up the theme on entrepreneurship in this one way. Government needs to be entrepreneurial, okay? Entrepreneurial diplomacy. And I think when you're thinking about the types of programs and the kinds of innovation, it's all about diplomatic entrepreneurship. And something that you and I and Karen Volker, who I'm so delighted is here today, really worked on starting in 2007, when we were looking at Muslims in Europe right after the Danish cartoon crisis, and began to really think about what can we do to lift up the voices of civil society at a time when our country was not popular. People didn't trust the president, in fact, didn't like him a lot. We're really angry with our foreign policy, but we understood so critically what both Evan and Sasha talked about in terms of the credible voices, those people who can speak on the ground better than a government can. So we understood that the role that the government can play is to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground. Now, how do you hear ideas on the ground? You have to listen. You have to go into those communities, into places where it isn't just at the U.S. Embassy, pulling together the same old people that are doing the same old things, that have been doing this for 20 years. It's really going out of the norm. What I used to talk about is going deep and going wide. So even though you would go pick your country with the U.S. Embassy and say, can you bring together somebody who's actually working on this particular issue? They'll say, yes, I have this partner. We've been working with them for such and such amount of years. We would say, okay, that's great. Bring that partner, but ask that partner to bring two people we've never seen before that are also in your field that we want to get to know. And that may sound really micro, and you might think, why is Farah talking about this? How do you hear? How do you hear different perspectives if you don't go to places you haven't been before? So what we were doing was not just staying in the capital cities, but we were going into crazy places within the countries where, by the way, even the locals would say, where did you go? Yeah. What are you doing? And by the end of our time, we had European governments coming to us saying, could you tell us who's doing what in our country, because we don't know. And I'm not saying this with pride, I'm simply saying this is what all governments need to do. We need to get out beyond the capital city. We need to go to voices we haven't heard. We need to talk about voices that are not the ones that are written about, but the people who are actually doing something, and that takes time. So being an entrepreneurial diplomat and actually pushing the kinds of programs and innovation means taking risk, and I will say both. 3 secretaries of state allowed us to do that. Secretary Rice, Secretary Clinton, and Secretary Kerry all said to me personally, take risks. And that is that I want to highlight that, because how can you be innovative if the only thing you care about is getting credit and making sure you haven't upset any apple carts, the apple cart, right? So we began to experiment. Now, you talked about a program, Sisters Against Violent Extremism, and Juan has been very modest in his role in this, but I want to use this example because Karen is in the room and she was very important to this, but it is a prototype for what we need to do. You will remember that after the Danish cartoon crisis, we were really looking at, only looking at the only major organization out there, Al-Qaeda, recruiting and doing things that we weren't sure, we weren't actually in the place we are today. We actually understand much more about how people get radicalized. But what we did know was that women have a role to play in pushing back against that ideology because they were seeing it first in their homes. And we know that they were seeing things often that the men weren't seeing. They were the canaries in the coal mines. They were picking up little things that were happening in the community that we needed to be able to monopolize. So what did we do? Juan at the time was the Assistant Secretary of the President and working on counterterrorism stuff. And he began to pull together a bunch of people around his table at the National Security Council who were creative thinkers. Karen was one. I was privileged to be there. There were a couple of others that we began to say, how do we use women in a new way? And as we began to brainstorm about what we could do, we had this crazy idea to create this movement of sisters against violent extremism. By the way, you're the one who coined that phrase. But
I'm not going to claim
but it's true. But the thing is, this is the point about government. instead of coming to the table going, we want to show the American flag, we want to make sure that everything was like credit for America, while everything we did was open and public, which is why I'm talking to you about it right now, we knew that small seed money from the State Department with a local partner on the ground could actually be an experiment that might work. And in 2008, we partnered with Edith Schaffler to say, do you think you could build this network in Europe? Well, she did, and she did it incredibly well. And she had amazing ideas that we hadn't even thought about. And she took it not just in Europe, but she built it around the world. And in 2015, this is the only organization that is doing the kinds of stuff with the mother schools. And this is all Edith's credit. This is not us, but we were the spark that began this. I'd like to see the United States government do far more along the lines of experimenting and being entrepreneurial and listening to the ideas of people, like the people in this room who come to you and say, I've been thinking about something for a really long time. I need the infrastructure to help that happen. And oftentimes, Juan, it was not tons of US government money because it was tainted money. They didn't want that money, but they wanted the innovation, they wanted the partnership, and they wanted the platforms. And I go back to what I said, the convener, the facilitator, and the intellectual partner. You asked a second question, and that is about where are the limitations of US government, and that is the underlying piece here. For all of the work around countering violent extremism, as much as people are actually very scared now because of ISIS. They see this growing threat. They don't know what comes after ISIS, and they're not as nervous about US government money as they once were. There's still a nervousness that exists. What the US government can do is to pull the kinds of networks that we see here today and scale them up so that we are acting as that convener and mobilizing, but we also can bring to the table what we're seeing. So the research piece of it, we know a lot about what the connection between something that's happening in Mauritania and something that's happening in Dushanbe, let's suppose. How do you pull those people together? One of the things I used to talk about in my role as special representative was that I was a talent scout. I was going around the world going, you need to meet this person, connect. You need to meet this person, connect. And I think we can do that, but our limit comes with the flag of the United States government, as strong and as wonderful as it is. In this particular field especially, people are that is where our limitation is, which is why we need to be more creative about how we can seed a wide range of innovative, experimental prototypes that can be scaled up and mobilized. And the final point I'll just say in terms of the limitation, as we all know, government is very slow. And it is really hard to move in a nimble way and in a creative way. So being able oftentimes to say, I have a great idea, but I'm going to give it to somebody else to do because we can't do it because they can move more quickly is the way to go.
Yeah, and they're often legal constraints, a notion of policy constraints.
Right.
So,
if I can just add that, and I know in this room alone we do have this, many of our exchange participants are civil society, people back in their countries. And so it's great for us to be able to support them and support civil society in that manner for that exact reason, because they can help affect change often from their perspective, sometimes better than we can connecting with governments, is connecting that way people to people. And the one other thing I'd like to say is we have alumni, which this whole group will be part of our alumni after you complete your time here on the exchange. And we try to stay connected with the alumni. And that's one way the US government, we think, has made this investment in the exchange and then hopefully stays connected to alumni around the world. We've already had 1 million alumni at this point through our programs, and stay connected to them because they've had that experience in the United States and they understand the United States, and they also are clearly innovators and community people back in their countries. So we really are pleased to try to maintain that connection.
I want to open it up in just a second to the audience and to questions for our distinguished panelists. But let me ask this, and this is less for this audience, because I think this audience understands this and is driving this issue. But for those who may watch now or later, because this will be online, and there's a lot of interest on women and extremism and what this means. In a thumbnail sketch, what's your sense of the role of women moving forward in countering all that we've talked about? What are the specific things that you see women able to do? And we've touched on it a bit, but crystallize it for those who may not understand this space quite as well. Why are women important, especially now?
Do you want to? Oh, sure. So in terms of, I would say two important things. Women are important now because we're seeing a change in the ecosystem. Okay, we talked about that a little bit. And we need to be able to articulate that change in a way that's authentic and real. We need women themselves to talk about what they're seeing in a really clear way. The second thing is, because we are seeing women radicalizing in new ways and at a pace that is really dangerous and scary, we need to understand the counter narratives to women getting radicalized. So there's something very specific that's happening and why they're changing and becoming more radicalized, but that means in order to counter that, there's specific narratives that have to work. Women can help create those counter narratives. I'm sorry, I said two, but my third point is this. I want to go back to the issue about the canary in the coal mine. Because women are a child's first teachers, the way they build their home will make a difference for all of humanity. So if a mother is against being altruistic or being open or being inclusive, chances are that child is not going to learn to be inclusive. So we need to engage the women so that they're raising the children the way we want: mutual interest, mutual respect, caring about each other, all the values. Everybody's nodding in this room. The values that we know matter. So we need to empower them to be able to do that, and we need to understand that if they're being influenced in a different way, we need to push back against it.
I would completely agree with Farah, and we know that women invest in their families. If they're earning money, they want to see their children thrive and succeed. They want to see them on a positive path, and so that's why women are really important to this dialogue. Also, we do know, this across the board, is that women have a different way of looking at things, a different lens through which they view a problem, and they may come up with a different solution. So we need to have their voices at the table, just as we've done here today, and through this whole exchange, so that we can hear what everyone here thinks the solutions and the issues are that we need to look at very carefully to this problem, because they're going to be different, perhaps, than what we might hear from men, and that's an important piece of it. And lastly, I would say, as we mentioned earlier, I think women are inherently collaborative, and they want to work together, and they want to share ideas, and they want to partner. And that in this, especially in what we're confronting with ISIL and extremism writ large, I would say is a really important piece, because we need to reach far and wide, and by networking and sharing ideas and information, and that's what women do very well, we'll be able to do that.
Could I go back to the last question you asked about government and limitations of government?
Sure.
You asked us. Can I ask you?
Well, I think you both answered a good bit of it. I think, in particular for the U.S. government, I think we are slow, less innovative, trapped in sort of our 1947 Act sort of authorities and stovepipes, and it's very difficult, especially when you're talking about what you've discussed and what all of you work on, which is how does the U.S. government catalyze networks of networks to counter a national security threat? That is incredibly hard for the government to do. I mean, we struggled with it in the Bush administration. I know the Obama administration has struggled in part as well. And in particular, in this context, where you're talking about radical movements that are trying to pretend to usurp one of the world's great religions ideologically, it's very hard for the U.S. government to come in credibly and to counter that ideology in ways that matter at the micro level and even at the macro level. So I think it's a major challenge, and kudos to both of you and to those in government like Karen and others who've done great work in this space, because the U.S. government at the end of the day has to be part of the solution, but it's not the way that this is going to be solved. It's going to be solved by the women in this room and the networks that you create. And I think that's the reality, and that's very hard for governments to do. And just a last point, Jared Cohen, who now runs Google Ideas and was a part of our little brain trust, and I appreciate what you said, Farah, earlier, often says that the 21st century is a very difficult time to be a control freak. And I think for governments, that's a very difficult thing. When you talk about programs, you talk about budgeting, you talk about how they seed programs, it's very hard for governments to sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. because governments like to control what they do and have to account for it. And so this is a very hard endeavor. I think we're still experimenting with what the role of government looks like. But at the end of the day, the solutions are going to come from you all and from networks like yours, as opposed to from the government in the first instance. That's at least my perspective. So why don't we open it up for questions and see what these two distinguished ladies have to say. Yes, ma'am. And remember, this is on the record, so if you'd like to identify yourself, you're welcome to.
Oh, thank you. I'm a social worker, and I noticed there, unfortunately, there's young children joining ISIS because, ISIS right now have a school. And they're telling me it's very fun, and they're coming, I am in Lebanon. So the borders are always open, and I speak with them. I went to a lot of conferences. Nobody mentioned awareness in schools and universities. I hope any government to focus on this. Awareness, awareness, awareness. And do you have an idea about awareness? Because there is a huge number that's going, even women, because they always focusing on women. They think women can give a huge generation to join ISIS. She can raise them and give them the beliefs. So I don't know where the awareness in this conversation, I'm not seeing it. Can you explain, or maybe you support my idea, I don't know. Thank you.
So if I understood you correctly, where is the awareness about what is taking place? Yep, and I couldn't agree with you more. We are, both government and non-government have failed in being really clear about what we're seeing for a lot of different reasons. That you're all very smart, you can understand some of it is political, some of it is not, but it is hard to be really truthful about what you see, which is why your voice is so important. If you don't, we keep talking about credible voices. What do we mean by that? We mean people on the ground who have the grit and the understanding and the recognition that their role in their communities is a credible one. And what we have to do in order to get to the awareness part is to make sure it is not just one person that's standing up, but that many people are standing up talking about the wave and the changes that are taking place. I've often thought a lot over the course of the last many years, why aren't there campaigns from parents to understand what's happening? They're getting news they're getting things from the news and not from society. I'm sorry, you're gonna.
I'm sorry, I want to say something.
Hold the mic.
I'm sorry for interrupting all the time, but it's, you're totally right. Who is the person who's going to give this awareness? Actually, I'm a social worker. I work in prison. I speak with terrorists and accused in terrorism. People who doesn't have kind of experience shouldn't do this awareness, should have experience or at least spoke with one. How they speak, how they talk, how they eat, how their daily lives. We need to understand them. The more we understand them, we know what kind of awareness we need to produce. Yes, ISIS, it's a 4 types. It's for Dr. Raymond Hamdan. I'm still working on it. Me and my sister doing huge research about these. They are psychopath, ethno-geographic political, ethno-geographic religious, and retributional. The youth are using the retributional, and the leaders, they're using politics and religious. So we need to do the awareness for the children, and the age, it's between 18 till 29, there's another awareness, and there should be another awareness for women. There are several categories. We cannot do one awareness on one category, because every children, one of the ISIS leaders spoke with ISIS guy, I spoke with him, he told me, ISIS is like a Disneyland.
Right.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, really? How Disneyland? He told me, we learned this and that and that and that. And I was like, and even the Supreme Court didn't support us because we're women. I don't know if they have problem with ovaries, maybe. And I'm too young to speak. Why you go do this such research? Go focus with others. And I hope that United States or other countries, please listen to my voice. Maybe I have small voice, I have small message, but please, all the countries here, please focus on awareness. So combating, maybe you can kill the leaders, but you have full generations coming up. And I don't think so that ISIS will end up in this year or second year. It will go for years, unfortunately. Thank you.
Your voice is powerful, by the way.
Yes, it is.
And
It really
it's heard.
is. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things, I think, just from a human psychology perspective, listening to the little boy who says ISIS is like a Disneyland, I think it's human nature that it's harder to prove a negative. It's very easy for ISIS to put itself out there and say it's Disneyland. It's harder for us to say to that little boy it's not, because the Disneyland sounds so fantastic, they attach themselves to that pretty quickly. And it's something we've talked about recently it's, on the messaging piece at State. Very hard to prove something is not, it's harder to prove something's not true than to, it's harder to refute. And that's our challenge in the messaging space. But you're absolutely right, we have to help partner with you to really launch an awareness campaign, and you're absolutely right also that the awareness campaigns have to be tailored for the particular demographics, because that's what ISIS is doing.
Yeah, very important.
Very.
We've got just 5 minutes left of this session, but let's keep a lot of the commentary for the rest of the day when it's closed and we can speak very openly as well. So we'll just take maybe one or two more questions and then switch out. Great.
This lady here. We'll go here and then here.
My name is Sunčana Roksanić-Vildička. I come from Croatia. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, and to hear what you think. I have to say, because Croatia has undergone through conflict, and at the same time we changed our economic system. So of course we have anomie in the society, and the thing is, and I agree completely with you, the thing is that we have to really connect different experts from different fields, because, for instance, transitional justice was facing only civil and political rights until recently, when economic and social and cultural rights are included. So without actually enhancing economic and social rights, raising awareness, it's fine and it's important, but it's not enough. So it's great to say you will be an excellent entrepreneur, you can do it. Of course it's necessary. But all economic social system must be really tackled. If we don't tackle that, we will always have conflicts, because we have always corruption and violations of those rights as the base for the conflict. That is I wanted to emphasize.
Why don't we, before we take comments, why don't we take the next question, make sure we get both in, and then you can address.
Thank you. My name is Sana Mandolini. I'm the Executive Director of the International Civil Society Action Network. We work with women across MENA, Asia, who are on the front lines of these issues. And one of the things when you work with women's civil society, as you know, is that they cut straight to the chase. And so with that, I will do that exactly right now. The extremist ideology that we're talking about comes from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Gulf states. We know this. It's been going for 30 years. It didn't just appear out of thin air. It's really important, if we're going to talk about this, to actually tackle that aspect of the story. So that's number one. Number two is that if we don't, I understand that we're talking predominantly about maybe radicalization in Europe and the US and elsewhere, but unless we deal with some of the fundamental roots right now that are being used to entice and encourage young people from the West to go to these places, the Syrian conflict, very much, the humanitarian crisis in Iraq, unless we've put the resources into really ending those and the political will to really tackling the Syrian conflict, we're going to have a flow-through of people forever. This is like, like the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s got Europeans and Americans and everybody going into Spain. So I think the root cause aspect of this is definitely something that has to be addressed, and I want to concur with my colleague there about the economic issues. We've perpetrated economic extremism for 30 years with neoliberal policies. These issues have to be put on the table. We can't just pretend that it's just online and it happened out of nowhere. Sorry to be so frank, but I think it's a good start. Thank you.
Great questions. Why don't we try to address them, take them in whatever order you want, address one or both, whatever you like. Evan?
Well, so at the State Department, we do have an economic bureau who deals really purely with economic policy, what I would call economic diplomacy writ large around the world, where they're dealing with these issues and dealing directly with countries like Croatia and looking at economic corruption and looking at ways to help share best practices in that field. And so we have, Farah knows this as well, at State Department, that those colleagues handle that issue directly. What I do in the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs is really give people at the grassroots level an opportunity to come here and learn about our best practices in entrepreneurship. But we do have people in other tracks and other areas addressing those issues head on. So I'll say that first.
Right. Yeah, I would just say two things. The first is that you talked about 30 years worth of an ideology that's building the ecosystem. And I'm glad you raised it. I'm glad you were clear about it. And I am equally frank. There is no way I could have traveled around the world with blinders on. I know what is going on. I've seen it. Government can't be the only one that's identifying things. Civil society can't be whispering in ears saying this is what's going on and not be clear about it. Until we talk very clearly about the influence of external actors that are changing the face of your communities on the ground as we speak, either by eradicating heritage and history, or by brainwashing children, or by bringing foreign imams in, or, I mean, I could go on and on and on. We are not going to get to the heart of things. So I applaud your clarity and your pointed comment on that. But the second thing is, this issue of the ecosystem and root causes. What Evan said is really important. Nobody is looking at this with only one dimension. Everybody is understanding that multidimensional component of all of this. And toward that end, I want to say this. The big problem, in my view, as we've talked about it publicly, is we talk about the hard power. We talk about the boots on the ground and the physical war that we are seeing, whether it's, you talked about Syria, whether we're, whatever. We look at things in a very concrete way on the physical side. You have to marry both the hard power and the so-called soft power together in a strategy so that you have a comprehensive approach to what is taking place. And so it is both the physical armies and the virtual armies that we're dealing with. And I think the only way we're going to get ahead of this is to combine that in a way that gives respect to both dimensions of the tools that we're talking about in our toolbox. I know we're behind time, so I'll close down. Yep.
I think we'll leave it at that. The good news is we've got a full 2 days together, and Farah's going to be chairing this next panel, so you can hit her with other questions. We're going to have time. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. But join me in thanking both Evan and Farah for their great insights.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you.